My name is Grace Lorrington. I am 67 years old, and last night my son laid his hand on me. He did not shout. He did not argue. He simply acted, as if something inside him had snapped. And I stayed quiet, completely quiet. I was standing in the kitchen when it happened. The soft hum of the refrigerator was the only witness. The overhead light buzzed faintly in the silence. I heard Nathan's heavy footsteps on the stairs afterward, the way the boards complained under his weight, the way the door to his room closed with the dull sound of finality. I did not cry, not a single tear. I did not raise my voice or protest. Instead, I placed my hand over the swelling on my cheek, the heat blooming beneath my skin like a warning I had ignored for too long. I stayed there for a while, in the center of my own home, surrounded by memories of a family I once believed was held together by love. The clock on the wall ticked toward midnight, the cold tile pressed against my feet. The air in the house grew still, too still, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath with me. When dawn arrived, it was pale and quiet. I woke at 4, an hour my body remembered from the years Samuel was alive, when he would leave early for the firehouse and I would pack him breakfast in a metal tin. The house felt colder that morning, or maybe I was the one who had changed. I laid a white tablecloth on the dining table, smoothing each crease with deliberate care. I took out the blue porcelain dishes Samuel had given me during our first year of marriage. They were delicate, trimmed with a thin silver rim, the kind of dishes we save for holidays and family celebrations. That morning, I set them out without trembling. I cooked a full breakfast, pancake batter hissing gently on the pan, bacon curling at the edges, slices of apple and berries arranged neatly on a plate, the aroma of fresh coffee rising in calm spirals. The kitchen filled with the quiet warmth of a home preparing for company. I moved slowly, methodically, as if performing a sacred ritual. Nathan came downstairs just after 7. His hair was tousled, his steps dragging with the same indifference he had shown me the night before. The moment he saw the table, his lips curled into a satisfied smile. Finally, "You learned." That is what he said, as if my silence had been an agreement, as if my pain the night before had been a lesson completed. I looked at him, not with anger, not with fear, simply with the clarity of a woman who had reached the edge of a long, dark road. I did not answer him. I did not need to. A sound at the front door cut through the room, firm, intentional, a knock that carried purpose. Nathan frowned, confused, then turned as the door swung open, and he saw who was sitting at the table. Judge Marlene Booker, stern and sharp-eyed, her presence filling the room like a sudden gust of wind. Officer Elias Morton, Samuel's old friend from the firehouse, his uniform pressed and respectful. Clara Bowman, a young community social worker, holding a folder against her chest with quiet resolve. 3 people were seated at our breakfast table. 3 people who did not come to accuse or shame, but to witness the truth. Nathan's smile vanished. It disappeared so quickly it looked as though someone had reached out and wiped it from his face. His shoulders stiffened, his breath caught, his eyes darted from one figure to the next. I could see realization settling over him, heavy, undeniable. He understood that something irreversible had begun. As for me, I stood tall beside the table, the morning light falling against my face. For the first time in years, I felt the ground beneath my feet, solid and steady. Silence had protected him for too long. Now it was protecting me. Before we continue, if you are listening to this story and you believe in the strength of quiet women, in the courage it takes to stand up after years of holding everything together, I invite you to like this video, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell. Your support helps stories like this reach the people who need them most. Now let me take you back to where it all began. Long before the morning, Nathan lost his smile. The clatter of the plates I set on the breakfast table that morning pulled me back into a memory I had avoided for years. It is strange how sound can open a door to the past, how something as simple as china touching wood can summon the face of a little boy who once clung to my apron strings with soft hands and hopeful eyes. before the house grew heavy with tension, before Nathan learned to harden himself against the world. There was a time when he was gentle, sensitive, almost painfully tender. I grew up in a generation that believed a woman's worth was measured by how well she held a family together. I married young, worked odd jobs, and built a home from thrift store furniture and love that stretched just far enough. When Samuel became a firefighter, pride and fear lived side by side in my chest every time he left for a shift. Still, I learned to swallow worry, to keep the house warm, to keep routine steady, to raise Nathan with the soft strength I inherited from my own mother. Nathan was 6 when he watched Samuel button his uniform jacket and tie the last knot on his boots. Even at that age, he stared at his father the way boys look at heroes, with admiration that feels almost like destiny. But Samuel missed birthdays, school plays, and the small moments that shape childhood quietly, not because he wanted to, but because duty demanded it. When the alarm at the station blared, everything else faded. Nathan understood it in theory, yet in the quietest hours, he felt the absence deeply. There was a night when thunder rolled through the neighborhood and the power went out. Nathan, barely tall enough to reach the kitchen counter, stood behind me trembling. I lit a candle for him and held him close. He whispered that he wished his father were home. I told him Samuel was out saving people who needed him, that he was brave, that he would always come back. Nathan nodded, but his eyes stayed fixed on the empty doorway. Years later, when he turned 12, Samuel gave him his pocket watch, a simple silver piece, scratched at the edges, steady in its ticking. He had carried it through storms, fires, rescues that pushed him to the limits of human endurance. That watch was his anchor, a reminder of time borrowed and time valued. Nathan held it like a sacred relic, running his fingers along the engraved initials. It became the emotional heart of our home, a symbol of responsibility Samuel hoped would guide our son as he grew into himself. But childhood expectations rarely align with the realities that follow. Nathan wanted a father who attended soccer games, someone who could teach him how to fix bicycles, someone who would sit at the edge of his bed at night and talk about the universe. Yet Samuel came home exhausted, soot lingering in his hair, silence hanging on him like a second uniform. He loved us fiercely, but the world had already taken more of him than we understood. As Nathan entered his teenage years, the gap widened. He became sharper in tone, quicker to retreat into his room, hesitant to look Samuel in the eye. I told myself it was normal adolescence, a phase, something that would soften with time. Yet deep down, a quiet ache formed when I saw him close himself off. I recognized the shape of his wound, the hollow built from longing and unmet expectations. I should have spoken to him about it. I should have asked what he needed. Instead, I chose silence, the same silence that was handed down through generations of women who believed peace was something you preserved by swallowing your truth. Setting the plates on the table in the present, I felt that old guilt rise again. The clink of porcelain brought back the image of 12-year-old Nathan polishing the pocket watch with a small cloth, waiting for Samuel to come home, hoping for attention that slipped through his fingers like ash. At that moment, I understood that the seeds of last night had been planted long ago, in cracks I had ignored to keep the house steady. I know where my son is vulnerable. I always have. I saw the way disappointment shaped him, the way unspoken pain gathered weight, but I hid those truths from myself because I thought it was kinder. I thought harmony mattered more than confrontation. Now, watching the morning light fall across the table set with the blue dishes Samuel gave me in our first year of marriage, I felt the weight of that choice settle on my shoulders. I whispered in my heart, "I knew where you were weak, my boy," but I tried to hide it to keep our home quiet. That quiet became the very thing that broke us. In the months leading up to that night, subtle changes began threading themselves through Nathan's behavior. At first, they were small enough to dismiss. A shift in his tone, a tension in his shoulders, a heaviness in his footsteps. But they grew, gathering weight the way a storm gathers power long before the first drop of rain. It started when his company announced a round of layoffs. He survived the first cut, but the news shook him deeply. He walked into the house one evening, loosened his tie with a sharp tug, and dropped onto the couch without a word. The air around him felt charged, restless, on the edge of something I could not yet name. The next week, he was called into a meeting and learned that his department would be restructured. He still had a job, but not the title he had worked for, not the recognition he expected. When he came home that day, he stood in the hallway for a long moment, staring at the floor as if he had misplaced something important. I asked how the meeting went. He answered with a shrug and walked to the kitchen. I followed quietly, feeling the shift in the house like a draft sneaking under the door. Nathan leaned against the counter, exhaling slowly. He said the company was blind to talent, that they promoted the wrong people, that his efforts were invisible. His voice trembled with frustration he refused to call fear. When I reached for a glass of water, he spoke sharply without turning around. "You do not understand how things work now. You do not know how hard it is." It was not what he said that stunned me. It was the bitterness in his tone. I could hear something inside him cracking, and I did not know how to reach it. I stayed silent, placing the glass in front of him, pretending not to feel the sting of his words. Over the following days, his sense of injustice grew. He paced more. He slept less. Sometimes he came home and dropped his keys onto the table with a force that made me flinch. He spoke faster, sharper. Every inconvenience became proof the world was against him. One evening, as I prepared dinner, he stepped into the kitchen and grabbed a plate from the cabinet with an abrupt motion. He set it down too hard, the ceramic ringing like a warning. Without looking at me, he murmured that he was always the one struggling, always the one carrying the weight, never appreciated. When I reached for a pitcher to pour water, he said again, louder this time, "You do not understand anything about what life is like now. You never had to deal with what I deal with." He rubbed his forehead with the back of his hand, fingers trembling slightly. I watched him from the corner of my eye, choosing my silence carefully. I knew he was hurting. I also knew that any attempt to comfort him might feel like an intrusion, a judgment, a reminder of everything he believed he was failing at. There were moments when I would walk into the kitchen and find him standing there alone, his back rigid, his fists clenched at his sides, his knuckles whitened as he struggled to breathe evenly. I would stop in the doorway, not wanting to startle him, not wanting to step into the space where his pride was bruised and raw. He would release his fists slowly, then look at the ground as if ashamed of what he felt. One morning he sat at the table with a cup of coffee he barely touched. His eyes were distant, unfocused, lost somewhere I could not follow. When I asked if he wanted breakfast, he said he was tired of carrying everything while I had the easy life. I felt my breath catch, a quiet ache spreading in my chest. I could have told him about the years I spent balancing bills, raising him alone while Samuel worked overnight shifts, standing in grocery aisles calculating every penny. But I did not. I knew his words came from a place of pain rather than truth. Still, every sentence he threw into the room left a mark. "You do not get it. I am the one struggling. I am the one who works." Each phrase landed like a small crack in the foundation of our home. One evening stands out in my mind. I stood at the kitchen sink washing vegetables while Nathan hovered near the refrigerator. He opened it with abrupt force, grabbed a bottle of water, and shut the door with a firm thud. His shoulders were rigid, his jaw clenched. When he turned, I saw his hands tighten into fists again, the muscles in his forearms tightening. I stepped aside, giving him space, pouring myself a glass of water with measured calm. I avoided the area between us, careful not to brush too close, careful not to ignite whatever spark was already burning in him. It was at that moment I realized how much of my life had become a dance around his fragile pride, how many steps I had taken to soften the edges of his anger. But storms do not stay quiet forever. They gather, swirl, and press against the walls until they find a way through. Nathan's storm was building. I could feel it in the house, in his voice, in the air around him. And despite all my efforts to steady the ground beneath us, something inside him had already begun to collapse. In the weeks after Nathan's frustration began spilling into our home, I found myself visiting the community center more often. I told myself I went for the sewing group or the morning exercise classes, but in truth, I went because the air there felt lighter. People smiled. People spoke gently. It gave me a few hours where the tension at home loosened its grip on my shoulders. One afternoon, as I watered the plants near the entrance, I noticed a young woman approaching me with a clipboard pressed to her chest. Her steps were careful, her posture attentive. The kind of presence shaped by listening more than speaking. She introduced herself as Clara Bowman, a social worker assigned to our district. She said she was checking in with regular visitors to the center to ensure they felt supported. There was something about her voice, soft but steady, that made me pause. She looked far too young to carry the weight I sensed behind her eyes. Yet when she spoke, there was a clarity in her tone that only comes from surviving something difficult. We sat on a bench outside, where the afternoon sunlight rested gently on the pavement. She asked how I was finding the programs at the center. I answered politely, telling her the classes were helpful and the staff kind. She smiled, but I could see she was watching more than my words. She studied the way I folded my hands, the way I glanced down before responding, the way my shoulders tensed when a noise in the distance startled me. Social workers often see what others miss. After a moment, she asked if everything felt stable at home. The question landed between us with surprising weight. I felt my breath catch. She quickly apologized if the question was too direct, explaining that her role sometimes required her to ask uncomfortable things. She said she had grown up in a home where silence swallowed problems until they became too heavy to escape. Hearing that, something inside me shifted. I asked her quietly what she meant. Clara hesitated before answering. She told me she had a mother who endured emotional mistreatment for years. Nothing loud, nothing violent, just the slow erosion of confidence, the shrinking of a woman who once laughed easily. Clara said she promised herself that when she became an adult, she would help women who reminded her of her mother, women who carried too much alone, women who mistook endurance for love. She looked at me with a gentleness that felt almost intrusive. In her expression, I recognized something I had not expected. No pity, not judgment, recognition, as if she were seeing a version of her mother in me, or perhaps a version of herself if she had not chosen a different path. I tried to reassure her that things at home were fine, that Nathan was simply under stress from work. She listened, but her face softened with the kind of understanding that comes from hearing similar explanations many times before. She asked whether I had someone to talk to when the house felt heavy. I said I managed. She tilted her head slightly, not convinced. Then she said something that struck me deeper than she could have known. She said that women often mistake silence for kindness, that we believe keeping peace means carrying pain quietly. She spoke as someone who had seen the consequences of that belief. I felt the truth of her words rise in my chest like a tide I had held back for too long. Before standing up to leave, she touched my forearm lightly and said a single line that has remained with me ever since. "Kindness isn't silence, Mrs. Grace." The words were not loud. They did not accuse, but they settled into my mind with a clarity that made the world around me seem sharper. I did not respond. I did not know how. Instead, I watched her walk back toward the center, her steps purposeful, her shoulders strong. For a long moment, I sat on that bench, hands folded in my lap, feeling the quiet shift inside me. Her sentence became the first thread of something new, a small but undeniable pull toward the moment when my silence would finally meet its limit. Clara's words stayed with me long after I left the community center. They followed me home like a quiet echo, weaving themselves into the shadows of the living room and the corners of the kitchen. Kindness isn't silence. I carried that sentence the way someone carries a fragile object inside their coat, close to the heart yet afraid to expose it to the air. But even those words could not prepare me for the night everything finally broke. Nathan came home later than usual that evening. I heard the front door open with a slow creak, followed by the sound of his shoes dragging across the hardwood floor. The house was dim except for the small lamp in the hallway. I stood in the kitchen making tea, letting the warm steam rise toward my face. When I heard him exhale sharply, I knew something had happened. He walked into the kitchen without greeting me. His tie was loosened, his collar wrinkled, his eyes dark with exhaustion and something heavier. He told me the company made another announcement. More restructuring, more uncertainty. He said his supervisor hinted that he should be grateful he even had a desk. Each word carried resentment that flickered beneath the surface like embers. I handed him a cup of tea, hoping the gesture would soften the tension. Instead, he stared at the cup as if it were an accusation. I asked gently whether he wanted to talk. He slammed his hand on the counter, not hard enough to break anything, but hard enough to make the room tighten around us. He said no one understood him, least of all me. His breathing grew uneven, his voice trembling between frustration and despair. He paced back and forth, muttering about coworkers who did less yet earned more. He said the world was unfair. He said he had sacrificed so much and received nothing in return. I stood still, watching the storm churn inside him. When I told him he was stronger than he believed, he turned toward me with an expression I will never forget: hurt, fear, anger, all tangled together. He stepped closer. I stepped back. It was instinct, not fear, though maybe the two had finally become the same thing. I tried to reach for the kettle to give my hands something to do, but he grabbed my wrist, not roughly at first, just tightly. His voice cracked when he said he was tired of feeling powerless, that everything was slipping away, that no one respected him. I whispered his name, telling him to breathe, to sit down, but something in him snapped. Perhaps it was the weight of all those disappointments. Perhaps it was the silence I had allowed for too long. In a single moment, a line that had held for years gave way. Nathan lost control. His hand struck me with a force he had never used before. The teacup slipped from my fingers. I watched it fall as though time had slowed. It hit the floor, spun in 3 uneven circles, and came to rest on its side, the warm tea spreading across the tiles like a small, quiet confession. The air impended. The house emptied. Every sound dissolved into a hollow stillness. Nathan froze for a heartbeat, looking at me as if unsure what he had done. Then he turned away. He walked out of the kitchen, up the stairs, and down the hall to his room. He did not look back. The click of his door closing was softer than I expected, almost gentle. And somehow, that made it worse. I stood there in the aftermath, my face throbbing, my hand trembling only slightly. Yet inside me, nothing shook, nothing screamed. I felt a stillness I had never known before, a calm clarity that frightened me more than the moment itself. It was as if something long dormant had opened its eyes. I walked to the bathroom and turned on the light. The bulb cast a muted yellow glow across the cracked mirror. I looked at my reflection, not searching for bruises, but searching for the woman I had become, the woman who had held a family together with silence, the woman who had learned to shrink herself to keep the peace. I placed my fingertips against the cool surface of the mirror and spoke to the woman staring back. "Grace, how many more years will you treat endurance as an obligation?" The question was not loud, but it filled the bathroom with undeniable truth. This was the pivot. The moment the quiet inside me shifted from resignation to resolve. I knew then that silence could no longer be my offering. Something had to change, and for the first time I understood that the change had to begin with me. I did not sleep the rest of that night. After leaving the bathroom, I walked through the house as quietly as I could, letting the silence wrap around me like a thin blanket. The walls felt different. The furniture felt unfamiliar. Every shadow seemed to ask the same question I had asked myself in the mirror. How many more years will you carry this as if it is your responsibility? I sat on the edge of my bed and breathed until the trembling in my hands settled. At some point, exhaustion tried to pull me under, but something stronger kept me awake. At 4 a.m, I rose. The air in the house was cold enough that I could see a faint cloud when I exhaled. Dawn had not yet touched the horizon. I wrapped my robe around myself and walked to the kitchen. My bare feet pressed against the tile, grounding me. The quiet felt sacred, as if the world had given me one small window to decide who I would be from this moment on. I turned on the kitchen light. It cast a soft glow across the counters. I took out the cutting board and placed it on the table. As the edge touched the wood, the sound echoed gently through the room. I reached for a knife and began slicing fruit, letting the blade meet the board with slow, steady taps. Each tap felt like a heartbeat I was reclaiming. The early morning chill crept into my sleeves, but I welcomed it. It kept me awake. It kept me present. When I moved to the stove to prepare pancake batter, the soft sizzling of oil filled the air. A faint trail of smoke curled from the pan when the first pancake cooked too long. The smell of slight burning settled into the room. I did not rush to fix it. I let myself move at a pace that felt deliberate, intentional, new. I brewed a pot of coffee next. The aroma lifted through the air, rich and warm. I inhaled deeply, grounding myself in its familiar comfort. The house remained silent except for the soft hum of the coffee maker and the occasional tap of metal against ceramic. It was the kind of silence that once made me feel small. That morning, it made me feel steady. When the table was nearly set, I walked to the small drawer beside the refrigerator. I had not opened it in months. Inside lay Samuel's pocket watch. The silver had dulled over time, but when I picked it up, it carried the same weight it always had. A weight of commitment, of duty, of love that survived exhaustion and danger, and nights when he came home smelling of smoke. I ran my thumb over the engraved initials on the back. For years, this watch had belonged to Nathan, then eventually made its way back into my hands after Samuel passed. I had kept it safe without fully understanding why. Now I know. It was the emotional anchor of our family, a symbol of the man who protected others for a living, even when it left him weary. A reminder of the standard we should have carried forward. I placed the watch in the center of the table, right between the plates and the folded napkins. It gleamed softly under the kitchen light, steady and sure. The moment it touched the table, something aligned inside me. This was no longer just breakfast. This was a boundary, a reckoning, a quiet trial held in the one room where I had swallowed the most silence. I looked around the kitchen. Everything was simple, familiar, ordinary. Yet the air felt different now, stronger, as if the house itself knew this morning would not follow the patterns of the past. I wiped my hands on a towel and stepped back, observing the table the way someone might observe a stage before the curtain rises. The white tablecloth lay smooth and unwrinkled. The dishes were set carefully. The fruit glistened. The pancakes sat stacked in soft layers. The coffee steam curled upward like a small, warm offering. This was the quiet beginning of a power reversal. Not loud, not dramatic, but intentional. I was preparing a morning that would no longer bend to fear or habit, a morning that would hold truth instead of silence. For the first time in years, I felt something inside me expand rather than shrink. I was not planning revenge. I was preparing for clarity. I was setting the table for a conversation that would no longer be swallowed in the name of peace. When I finally sat down, the house seemed to inhale with me, and I knew that when Nathan walked into this room, the world he had known, our world, would no longer be the same. The house was fully awake by the time the clock neared 7, though sunlight was only beginning to push a pale line across the kitchen floor. I sat at the table with my hands folded neatly, listening to the steady tick of Samuel's pocket watch. The breakfast I had prepared earlier remained untouched, resting between the plates like a quiet declaration. The air in the house held a rare stillness, not the kind that comes from fear, but the kind that precedes truth. The first knock arrived with a firmness that told me it was not a social call. I rose carefully from my chair, smoothing the front of my robe as I walked down the hallway. When I opened the door, a cool breath of morning air swept into the house. Judge Marlene Booker stood tall on my porch. Her coat was buttoned to the collar, her eyes as sharp as I remembered from the courthouse years ago. Gray strands threaded through her dark hair, not signs of age, but signs of battles fought and decisions made. She held a leather bag in one hand and regarded me with a nod that carried more weight than words. "Mrs. Lorrington," she said, "may I come in?" I stepped back to let her enter. She walked with a dignified steadiness, heels tapping lightly against the floor as she made her way toward the kitchen. She took a seat at the table without speaking further, as though she understood that unnecessary words would only dilute what this morning represented. The second knock came with more weight. This one echoed through the hallway with a familiarity I felt in my bones. As I opened the door again, Officer Elias Morton stood there in full uniform, cap tucked respectfully under his arm. His expression was gentle, shaped by years of showing up for families on their hardest days. He had served with Samuel at the firehouse. Their friendship had been forged in heat, danger, and the kind of trust only firefighters understand. "Grace," he greeted me. His voice carried compassion and quiet strength. I felt my throat tighten at the sight of him. For a moment, I saw Samuel in the lines of his face, in the steadiness of his presence. Elias stepped inside, nodding politely toward the judge before setting his cap on the table. His gaze lingered briefly on Samuel's pocket watch, sitting between the plates. I saw recognition in his eyes, and perhaps a hint of grief. Before I could take my seat again, a softer knock sounded, lighter, almost hesitant. When I opened the door, Clara Bowman stood there, a folder clutched firmly in her hands. She wore a simple cardigan and flats, but her posture held quiet resilience. She looked at me first, then at the house behind me, as if gauging the atmosphere before stepping forward. "Good morning, Mrs. Grace," she said. "I brought the documents we discussed." I invited her in. As she walked toward the kitchen, the faint scent of paper and lavender followed her. She paused for a heartbeat when she saw the judge and the officer, then took her seat at the table with a calm, prepared expression. The folder rested in front of her like a shield made of truth. The room settled into a thick, meaningful silence. No one asked what happened. No one pressed for details or forced me to relive the night before. Their quiet was not avoidable. Their quiet was respect. Their presence spoke louder than any interrogation could. Judge Booker folded her hands, her expression steady. Officer Morton sat upright, back straight, eyes tracking the staircase from time to time. Clara opened her folder but did not pull out a single sheet yet. They were waiting for the right moment, allowing the morning to breathe. The ticking of the pocket watch became the room's metronome. The soft steam rising from the untouched coffee added warmth to the still air. My breath felt anchored for the first time in years. From upstairs, a faint thump echoed, a drawer closing, a footstep shifting weight. Nathan was awake. Each sound tightened the room just slightly, adding a thin thread of suspense that wove itself through all four of us. Yet none of us moved. We let the silence hold us, shape us, prepare us. I realized then that this was the first time in a long time that silence belonged to me. Not to fear, not to confuse, not to guilt. It belonged to choice. And the people at my table honored that choice by sitting with me in it. We waited. We breathed. And in that suspended moment, as the house inhaled around us, I understood that I was not alone anymore. The staircase creaked softly above us, each sound pressing gently into the silence we were holding together. Judge Booker lifted her gaze for a moment, not in alarm, but in acknowledgement. Officer Morton straightened his posture, shoulders steady. Clara folded her hands quietly on top of her folder. The watch on the table ticked in deliberate rhythm, marking the seconds as if preparing the house for what would come next. Nathan's footsteps grew closer, slow, heavy, careful in a way that suggested he was trying to sense the mood of the morning before entering it. I kept my eyes on the center of the table, on the pocket watch that had survived fires, storms, and years of faded hope. I let the silence hold me upright. It was the strongest armor I had ever worn. When Nathan reached the bottom step, I felt him pause. The air shifted with his presence even before he entered the kitchen. Then he stepped inside. His eyes went first to the table, the white cloth, the plates, the fruit, the pancakes kept warm beneath a folded towel. Then to me. He smiled, a slow, thin smile, the kind he had used the night before, the kind meant to assert control without raising his voice. He leaned slightly against the doorframe and said the same words he had said after hurting me. "Finally, you learned." The words drifted into the room, seeking a place to land. I felt them touch my skin, but they no longer pierced. They simply passed through like a gust of wind through an open window. I did not answer him. I did not bow my head. I did not shift my gaze. I remained still. And then the front door opened. Nathan turned. He saw who was seated at our table, Judge Marlene Booker, with her unwavering eyes and posture carved from decades of standing between justice and cruelty. Officer Elias Morton, resting his weathered hands on the table, the quiet steadfastness of a man who had carried others out of burning buildings. Clara Bowman, young but unshaken, her folder placed neatly before her like a shield of truth. Nathan's smile faltered, then disappeared entirely. The shift was immediate and unmistakable, his face drained of certainty. His breath hitched the way a child does when he realizes a parent has seen the thing he wished to hide. He looked at me again, confusion running through him like a quiet tremor. He stepped backward slightly, as if the ground beneath him had tilted. His hand brushed the counter for balance. For several seconds, no one spoke. It was the silence that carried the weight of everything. He finally whispered, "What is this?" No one answered. Not yet. The judge gestured gently toward the empty chair across from me. A simple motion, not forceful, not commanding, but inevitable. The kind of gesture that leaves no room for escape and yet does not threaten. Nathan hesitated. He stood with his fingers curling against his palms. I saw the small trembling in his hands, the slight quiver in his breathing. He looked again at the watch on the table, as if it might offer him guidance. Then, slowly, he walked to the chair and sat down. His knee shook underneath the table. His jaw tensed. He kept his eyes lowered, unable to meet mine. Judge Booker was the first to speak. Her voice was steady, calm, precise. She told him she was not there to punish him. She said she was there because she had seen, too many times, what happens when silence becomes the primary language of a home. Then she added something that tightened the air in the room. I once presided over a case very similar to this one. A mother, a grown son, years of quiet tension, years of swallowed pain, and one night a moment of anger took the wrong turn. She died because she stayed silent for too long. The words settled over the table like a slow tide. Nathan lifted his head, eyes widening with shock. He opened his mouth as if to protest, but no sound left him. His breath grew uneven. The reality of what could have happened began to take shape behind his eyes. I watched him, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with the ache of a mother who knows that truth, when finally spoken, is both knife and balm. Clara leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but clear. She said she had met countless families where harm was disguised as stress, where apologies were replaced by excuses, where the person suffering most believed endurance was their duty. She looked at me briefly, then at Nathan. "Silence does not protect anyone," she said. Officer Morton added that Samuel once told him that Grace should always be protected, not only from danger, but from carrying burdens alone. The mention of Samuel softened something in the room. I saw it land on Nathan like a memory he had forgotten how to hold. Nathan pressed his hands together tightly. His shoulders drew inward, his posture deflating under the weight of everything unspoken. He whispered, barely audible, "I did not mean to hurt her." The judge answered gently, "Intent matters, but impact matters too." His throat tightened. His eyes glistened with a shame he had never allowed himself to feel, and for a brief moment I wondered whether I had gone too far inviting these three here, whether exposing him to their presence was harsh, whether my attempt to reclaim my voice might wound him more deeply than necessary. That is the moral conflict every mother carries. The line between protection and accountability is never clear, but as I looked at the bruise faintly blooming on my cheekbone, I knew one truth with certainty. Silence had brought us here. Honesty would have to carry us out. For a long moment after Nathan lowered his gaze, the kitchen held a silence so complete it felt almost ceremonial. The morning light grew stronger, stretching across the table in soft bands of gold. The watch between us ticked steadily, its rhythm patient and unhurried, as if marking the beginning of something none of us could yet name. Judge Booker did not begin with questions. She did not raise her voice or deliver a harsh reprimand. Instead, she shifted her chair slightly and looked at Nathan with the composed firmness of someone who has spent her life listening to difficult truths. She said she was not here to accuse him or to condemn him. She was here because silence in a family is often the heaviest weight, and today was the day that weight needed to be lifted. Nathan swallowed hard. His eyes moved from face to face, searching for judgment, perhaps expecting anger. None came. Elias Morton was the first to speak. His voice carried the steadiness of someone who had pulled people from burning houses and stayed beside families whose worlds had fallen apart in a single night. He said he had known Samuel for decades. He said Samuel was a man of duty and loyalty, someone who protected everyone he could reach. Then Elias said something that softened the entire room. Samuel once told me that if anything ever happened to him, I should look out for Grace. Not only from danger, but from carrying too much alone. The words landed gently, like warm hands placed on my shoulders. Nathan's head snapped upward. I saw the pain flash in his eyes. He whispered, "Dad said that." Elias nodded. With calm certainty, he said Samuel had always admired my strength, but worried that I bore too much in the name of peace. Nathan blinked rapidly, processing the idea that his father had seen me more clearly than he ever realized. Clara placed her hand lightly over the folder in front of her. She spoke quietly, explaining she had seen patterns like this before. Families where stress disguised itself as anger, where unspoken expectations twisted into hurt. She said she had noticed signs in me the first day we met at the community center, signs of someone carrying emotional strain that had nowhere to go. She listed them softly. The way I flinched when a door closed too quickly, the way I smiled gently while my hands shook slightly, the way I dismissed my own needs as unimportant. Her tone was compassionate, not clinical. She said she recognized those signs because she had grown up in a home where her own mother had worn the same expressions. Nathan's breathing became uneven again. He rubbed his hands together anxiously. He insisted he had never meant to hurt me. He said he was overwhelmed, stressed, afraid of losing everything. His voice cracked as he defended himself, shaking his head rapidly. He said he never wanted to be someone who caused his mother pain. Then the crack inside him widened. Tears welled in his eyes before he could stop them. He tried to wipe them away with the back of his hand, embarrassed, but they kept falling. For a moment, he pressed his fists against his forehead and whispered that he felt like a failure, that the world had backed him into a corner he could not escape. He said he had convinced himself that I would always understand, always forgive, always carry what he could not. Clara leaned forward and said gently that understanding is not the same as absorbing harm. Elias nodded in agreement. Judge Booker added that harm can grow from silence as much as from anger. Nathan broke again. More tears, more shaking, more apologies tangled with defensiveness. Then, finally, he said nothing. He sat completely still, silent, breathing heavily. The weight of all the unspoken years gathered on his shoulders. I watched him, my son, my child, my heartbreak, my responsibility, my limit. I felt something rise in me, not anger, not triumph, but truth, a truth I had buried beneath decades of sacrifice and softness. I reached for the watch on the table, holding it gently in my palm. Its familiar weight steadied me. I looked at Nathan. My voice did not tremble. I said the sentence that had lived inside me for years, waiting for the moment it could finally breathe. You are my blood, but I am also a human being. The words floated across the table like a quiet verdict, not cruel, not sharp, just real. And realness, after so much silence, was its own kind of justice. Nathan's face crumpled. He leaned forward, hands covering his eyes, releasing a sound between a sob and a sigh. A sound of someone realizing he had never truly seen his mother until this moment. The judge let the silence settle. She knew it needed room. None of us rushed to fill it. None of us tried to comfort prematurely. The silence was doing its own work. Eventually, Nathan straightened, wiping his cheeks with shaking hands. He whispered that he did not know how to fix what he had broken. I told him gently that fixing begins with seeing, and for the first time in a long time he was seeing me. When the silence in the kitchen finally settled, it felt less like a weight and more like a doorway, a quiet opening into whatever needed to come next. Nathan sat hunched over, his shoulders drawn inward, his fingers laced together tightly as if he were trying to keep himself from falling apart. The judge watched him with collected composure. Elias kept a steady gaze, concerned but calm. Clara held the folder in her lap, waiting for the moment when the truth could take its next shape. No one rushed, no one shouted, no one pointed blame. Judge Booker spoke first. She explained that situations like ours were not matters for handcuffs or harsh punishment. They were matters for intervention, for structure, for trained support. She said the law had pathways designed specifically for episodes caused by emotional collapse, prolonged stress, and escalating behavior. Paths intended not to ruin families, but to help them find stability before something irreversible happened. Nathan swallowed hard and looked up. His eyes were red, still damp from tears he had not wanted to shed in front of anyone. He asked in a trembling voice whether he was being arrested. The fear in his tone felt raw, childlike, vulnerable in a way I had not seen in years. Elias shook his head gently. He said, "No one is here to take you away, son." His voice carried the quiet gravity of someone who had seen the aftermath of choices left unexamined. "We are here to make sure you get help before this becomes something neither of you can come back from." Clara opened her folder and slid a few papers forward, keeping them within Nathan's reach, but not pushing them toward him. She explained that the county offered a crisis recovery program for adults experiencing emotional destabilization, counseling, monitoring, anger management, mental health evaluation, all confidential, all legally structured to support both the individual and the family. Nathan stared at the papers without touching them. His lips parted, but the words seemed to dissolve before they formed. He whispered that he did not want to be seen as broken. Clara told him softly that asking for help does not mean broken. It means responsible. Judge Booker leaned back slightly and said, "This is not a punishment, this is a chance." Her voice carried authority, but also something warmer beneath it, and chances rarely appear twice. Nathan's eyes drifted to me, searching, scared, still my son. He asked whether I wanted this. The question quivered through the room like a thin thread pulled too tight. I breathed in slowly before answering, not to steady myself, but to honor the truth I was about to speak. I told him that what happened last night could not be ignored, that love cannot survive in fear, that the home we built together would not last if silence continued to bury our pain. But I also told him something else. I told him that I wanted him to heal, that I wanted him to rise again, that I wanted him to learn how to stand without hurting himself or anyone around him. His eyes softened, filling with another swell of tears. Elias gently suggested that they accompany Nathan to the intake office that morning. No cuffs, no escort, just support, a structured beginning. Nathan nodded slowly, a nod filled with fear but also surrender. Not the surrender of defeat, but the surrender of someone finally letting go of the heavy armor he had worn for too long. He stood up shakily. Clara rose with him, guiding him with a respectful distance. Judge Booker gathered the papers. Elias placed a steadying hand near Nathan's shoulder, not touching him, but close enough to offer reassurance. Before he left the kitchen, Nathan glanced at the watch on the table. His face tightened with emotion so deep it nearly undid me. He whispered, "I am sorry, Mom. I do not know how I got here." I stepped closer, but not to hold him. Not yet. I simply said, "You will learn, and I will be all right." He nodded again, then walked toward the door with the 3 people who had come not to break our family, but to brace it. As the door closed behind them, the house exhaled. I stood in the center of the kitchen, hands resting lightly on the back of a chair. I felt neither anger nor relief, only a slow, steady breath, a breath I had not taken in years. In that quiet, A truth settled into my heart, gentle but firm. I did not lose my son today. I simply let him stand on his own. The morning after Nathan left with the judge, the officer, and Clara, the house felt strangely light. Not empty, not relieved, simply breathing again. The quiet no longer pressed against my skin like a warning. It rested beside me gently, as if waiting to see what I would do next. I made a cup of tea and stood by the window, watching the garden I had neglected for far too long. The soil looked dry. The roses drooped with exhaustion. It occurred to me that healing, much like gardening, requires tending, patience, and the willingness to get your hands a little dirty. That afternoon, I stepped outside with my gardening gloves and a small trowel. The air carried the scent of damp earth left behind by the sprinklers next door. I knelt beside the first rosebush Samuel and I had planted together, the one that bloomed in soft pinks during early summer. As I loosened the soil, a breeze swept past me, lifting strands of my hair. I felt the sun warm my back. For the first time in years, the simple act of kneeling in the dirt grounded me. It reminded me that life, even when cracked, can sprout again. I spent hours pruning, watering, trimming, and clearing out the dead leaves. My knees ached and my hands trembled from the effort, but the ache felt honest, necessary. When I finally stood up, wiping sweat from my forehead, the garden looked a little less weary, a little more hopeful, a mirror of what I hoped was happening inside me. A few days later, Clara called to check in. She asked how I was managing. I told her I had started tending to the garden again. She smiled through the phone, saying progress often begins with caring for something outside ourselves. She asked gently whether I had considered attending therapy sessions at the community center. I hesitated, then surprised myself by agreeing. The next week, I walked through the center's doors and met with a therapist named Ellen. She welcomed me with soft eyes and a notebook she barely used. She said her job was not to fix me, but to walk beside me while I learned how to breathe again. We talked about Nathan, about the years of silence, about the quiet weight I had carried since Samuel's death. Ellen never rushed me. She never filled the spaces I struggled to speak into. She let me discover my own words, one small truth at a time. Between sessions, I found myself moving differently through my home. I opened curtains that had stayed closed for months. I cooked meals for myself rather than picking at leftovers. I took short walks around the neighborhood in the evenings. Each step felt like reclaiming a part of myself I had forgotten existed. One afternoon, while I trimmed the hydrangeas near the fence, my neighbor Martha called my name. She shuffled toward me, leaning slightly on her cane. She was 70, sharp-tongued when she wanted to be, but gentle in spirit. She looked at the garden, then at me, and said she was proud of how alive everything looked again. I laughed quietly and told her I was starting small. She studied my face for a long moment, then said something that settled deep in my chest. "I am 70 years old, Grace, and I have never found the courage to do what you did." Her voice did not hold pity. It held admiration, the kind that makes you stand a little straighter without realizing it. I told her I had simply reached the limit of what silence could hold. She nodded knowingly and replied, "Sometimes the quietest decisions are the strongest." As we talked, a soft breeze rustled the leaves above us. The light filtered through in warm patches across the ground. Martha turned to go, but paused at the edge of the walkway. She looked back at me and repeated the sentence Clara had offered weeks earlier. "Kindness is not silence." Then she added, "And silence is not peace." Her words echoed in my mind long after she left. They threaded themselves into my thoughts as I watered the garden, folded laundry, and sat on the couch with the afternoon sun warming my shoulders. Healing did not come in sweeping waves. It came in small, steady shifts. In the mornings when my breath did not tremble. In nights when I slept without bracing for footsteps. In moments when I felt like someone worth protecting. By the end of the month, the roses bloomed again. Soft pink, bright red, a few pale yellows. Each one felt like a quiet affirmation that even after seasons of neglect, life finds a way to return if we make space for it. And in those blooms, I felt the first quiet promise of my own return. Several weeks passed before I heard anything from Nathan. I knew he had entered the crisis recovery program because Clara kept me informed with brief updates, careful not to share more than the law allowed. She said he was attending sessions, meeting with counselors, and learning how to identify the emotions that had been piling up inside him for years. I tried not to imagine what those rooms looked like or what he sounded like when he spoke. Healing is a private process, and I wanted to respect the space he needed. During those weeks, I kept tending to the garden and attending therapy. Each day arrived quietly, offering small pieces of peace I had never noticed before. Some mornings I found myself standing in the sunlight with my eyes closed, breathing in a way that felt almost new. Other days I cried without warning, not from sadness alone, but from release. Healing is never a straight line. It curves, it stutters, it returns to old wounds before stepping forward again. One early afternoon, I came home from the community center with a small stack of pamphlets Ellen thought might help me. When I opened my front door, I noticed an envelope lying neatly on the floor, just beyond the welcome mat. My name was written on the front in Nathan's handwriting, steady, but softer than I remembered. My heartbeat changed its rhythm as I picked it up. The envelope felt light, almost hesitant. I carried it to the kitchen and sat down at the table, the same table where the watch still rested each morning, catching small reflections of sunlight. With gentle fingers, I opened the envelope and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. There were no long paragraphs, no dramatic apologies, no explanations or justifications, only one line, written slowly, each letter pressed carefully into the page. Mom, I want to be someone Dad would be proud of. I read the sentence once, then again, then a third time. Each reading pulled a different thread inside me. Grief, hope, memory, something unspoken that had waited years to breathe. I did not cry, though my eyes softened. I did not speak, though words rose in my chest. Instead, I let the silence wrap around me gently, the way Clara once said silence can hold truth when used with intention. Nathan had not asked for forgiveness. He had not promised dramatic change. He had not attempted to rewrite what happened. He had simply offered a seed, a beginning, a single line that did not erase the past, but acknowledged the path forward. I touched the paper with the back of my fingers, feeling the indentations where he had pressed the pen too hard. It reminded me of when he was a child learning to write his name, how he would grip the pencil so tightly his knuckles would turn white, determined to prove he could do it on his own. That same determination lived in this sentence. After a few minutes, I stood and walked to the drawer near the refrigerator. I opened it slowly and took out Samuel's pocket watch. The metal was cool against my palm, its familiar weight grounding me. I pressed the side latch and opened it, revealing the small inner compartment where Samuel used to keep tiny notes of encouragement during his long shifts. A habit only firefighters truly understood, a way of carrying hope through dangerous nights. I folded Nathan's letter once, carefully, and slipped it into the compartment. It fit perfectly, as if it belonged there. I closed the watch and held it in both hands, feeling the steady presence of the man who had shaped both of us, the man who had loved fiercely, quietly, completely. Standing in the quiet kitchen, sunlight warming the table, I felt a stillness settle into me, not the old stillness of suppression, but a new stillness shaped by clarity, acceptance, a fragile but honest sense of beginning again. This was not a resolution. It was not reconciliation. It was not the closing of a chapter. It was a pause, a breath, a beautiful moment of stillness between what had been broken and what might one day be rebuilt. I placed the watch back on the table, letting it rest in the patch of warm light. In that quiet, I allowed myself to hope, not loudly, not urgently, just enough to imagine the possibility of something soft growing between us again, a small seed, a late seed, but a seed nonetheless. I spent the following days carrying Nathan's letter inside my mind the way someone carries a small flame cupped in both hands, careful not to smother it, careful not to let it burn too quickly. The watch remained on the kitchen table, its weight steady, its ticking softer than usual, as if even time itself understood that healing does not need to rush. The house no longer felt haunted by fear. It did not feel triumphant either. It simply felt honest. Walls that had once absorbed the tension now held a quieter kind of truth. I made tea in the mornings without bracing for footsteps. I tended the garden without glancing toward the house to see if anyone was watching. My breaths felt fuller, my movements less careful, my voice a little stronger each time I answered the phone or greeted Martha over the fence. One evening near the end of spring, after a long day of therapy and gardening, I stepped onto the front porch with a blanket draped over my shoulders. The sun was setting behind the row of maple trees lining our street. The sky glowed with streaks of warm gold and cool lavender. It was the kind of light Samuel used to call the quiet hour, when the world seems to hold still long enough for you to feel your own heartbeat. I settled into the old rocking chair he had built for me decades ago. The wood creaked softly under my weight, welcoming me back. In front of the porch, the roses I had nurtured over the past week swayed gently in the evening breeze. Their petals caught the last rays of sunlight, glowing like small lanterns. The sound of children playing in the distance drifted across the street. A dog barked 2 houses down. A car door shut softly somewhere. All these ordinary sounds felt comforting, grounding. Life moves at its natural pace, without the sharp edges that had once filled my home. As I rocked slowly, my thoughts wandered to Nathan, the little boy who used to climb into my lap with scraped knees, the teenager who built walls around his heart faster than I could dismantle them, the man who had cracked under the weight of expectations he never learned to voice. I did not know what shape his healing would take. I did not know if he would return home one day or if our connection would remain a fragile thread stretched across distance. I did not need to know. Healing does not follow a script. It follows willingness. What mattered was that he had taken his first step, and so had I. The breeze picked up, rustling the leaves of the rose bushes. One petal detached and drifted slowly to the porch steps. I followed its path with my eyes, feeling something stir quietly inside my chest. Not sorrow, no regret, something closer to acceptance. I whispered into the evening air, "I finally learned too, Nathan." The words carried gently across the porch, dissolving into the golden light, a final echo to everything that had brought us to this moment, an acknowledgement that healing is not only for the wounded, but for those who have spent years trying to hold others together without remembering to hold themselves. I leaned back in the chair, letting my eyes rest on the horizon. I realized then that strength does not always roar. Sometimes it arrives in the form of sitting still, unafraid of your own company. Sometimes it arrives in choosing peace even when chaos once felt familiar. Sometimes it arrives in allowing yourself to no longer be the one who absorbs everything. The garden rustled again, a soft rhythm, steady and patient. Flowers grow toward the light without ever making a sound. As the sun dipped lower, I reached for the watch resting on the small table beside me. I opened it gently, touching the folded letter inside. Nathan's handwriting stared back at me, steady and sincere. I closed the watch and held it against my chest for a moment, feeling both the weight of the past and the promise of whatever future might come. I did not know whether he would call. I did not know whether we would rebuild slowly or suddenly, or whether the distance between us would remain for longer than I hoped. But I had released the need to control the outcome. Healing, I realized, is not about forcing a reunion. It is about allowing both people to stand on their own feet first. The porch grew cooler as the sun disappeared, but I stayed seated, listening to the rhythm of my own breathing blending with the gentle rustle of roses. I felt whole, not fixed, not perfected, simply whole. And in that sense of wholeness, I found space to speak to those who might one day hear my story, To those who sit in silence, waiting for the moment when courage finally outweighs fear. To those who still believe their voice is too small to matter. If you have ever lived through something that forced you to rise in silence, please share your story in the comments. Someone out there may need to hear it. Someone out there may find their strength because you found yours. And if you are listening now, know this: it is never too late to stand. It is never too late to choose peace. And it is never too late to become someone you yourself would be proud of.